Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2u.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so my guest for this episode is the author of The End of Aspiration. It's Duncan Exley. Duncan, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you. So do you want to start by telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do?
Yes, I'm not employed as an academic, I think, is one of the things that makes me different here. But what I did is that I wrote the book, End of Aspiration, partly because although I was almost sort of comically stereotypical in being a social mobility story, in that, my dad was a mine worker, my mum was a hairdresser, sometimes a shop assistant. What I saw about social mobility that was said in what the academics were saying, what politicians were saying, all that sort of stuff, didn't really reflect my experience, either in terms of what had happened to me or in terms of what had motivated me to pursue what used to be called ideas above your station. And so I really wanted to examine that and talk to other people and really work with other people who would experience social mobility. So that was my motivation, if you like, for getting into this sort of thing.
Yeah. And do you mind saying a little bit more about that? So you came from a kind of classic working class background, would you say? So were you the first to kind of go on to further and higher education within the family unit?
I wasn't. My sister was.
Yeah.
And my sister was actually, she says, the only girl from her school year to go to university.
Wow.
She's 8.5 years older than me. But still, it is not a background where people went into university, really. So I think I was in a number of ways stereotypical, and that, like I say, almost comically stereotypical in a Billy Elliot sort of mind-working way. But a few things were not stereotypical that I think are probably important that the data might miss. That my dad was one of those people who had what used to be called ideas above his station. So he'd be one of those people who'd put H's on words, even if they didn't need an H, to be honest. And although he worked down the mine, he was a electrical engineer. So he'd be grappling with the machinery, but he'd be in a skilled job amongst unskilled workers. So that gives you ideas above your station. And that sort of led him to do a bit of sort of distancing himself, I think, socially from other people. And that gives you a bit of an idea of yourself and of your prospects. But also, I think what was really important for me, and this is one of the things that is discussed early on in my book, was the role of my sister. When my sister was very young, my dad's marriage broke up and she found herself the daughter of a single parent. My sister was actually looked after by his sister, who was a school teacher. And that really gave her a lot of investment in her education that she wouldn't have got otherwise. And I think that's really important to the aspirations that gave me and the expectations that gave me. But also, and I think this is reflected in people I found in my book as well, is that I didn't fit in very well in a working class, very masculine background. I wasn't very good at doing masculinity. And that's reflected in my book as well, that a lot of people I interviewed said I was a bit of a misfit. And that's something that I think about a lot, that there's actually in social mobility quite a bit of pain, if you like, of leaving the background you came from and having to distance yourself from it, sometimes geographically. But if you're a bit of a misfit where you grow up, it's it's quite painful where you are anyway, so it's all the same to you.
Yeah. And you're not supposed to ask people's age, Duncan, but I'm intrigued to know what kind of era this was in terms of your social mobility movement.
Oh, well, I'm fine on my age. I'm 48.
Yeah.
And so the social mobility movement was, I was going to school and I was 12 when the miners' strike happened. Which was a big thing, partly a big thing for the impact on poverty, the impact of poverty on people around. Most people's dads who I knew, including my own, didn't get paid for a year. But also because it became evident at that point that the mines weren't a great career option. And that, I think, prompted a few people to start thinking, well, we can't just follow our dads down the mine here.
Yeah. The reason I ask is because obviously you've spoken to people from all different walks of life, but for most of those people, were they socially mobile in that kind of Thatcher era, or is it all different eras you're looking at?
I've done quite a lot of different eras there. So there were people who I interviewed who, one of them was a student at university who was around 20 at the time. The oldest one was around retirement age. And that was something that was important, that what really happened in previous generations was that there was a lot of upward social mobility, getting white-collar jobs or getting more highly skilled blue-collar jobs than your parents had had, largely because there was an expansion in the number of those jobs. That there really isn't now.
Yes,
we've got a lot more low-skilled jobs. I think something like a third of people who have got a degree are in a job that doesn't require one, and that was something that was really coming out, I think, in the people I spoke to.
Well, let's explore that a little bit more then. So I gave part of the title of your book, The End of Aspiration. Do you want to tell us the full title and a little bit about how it got started?
Yes. It's called The End of Aspiration, Social Mobility and Our Children's Fading Prospects. It's a lot more cheery a book than it sounds like. But a conversation with the publisher, they said, well, nobody's ever bought a book that's called Everything's Fine, Don't Worry About It. But despite that, there are quite a lot of things that are heading in a problematic direction for people who, as I say, are trying to pursue what used to be called ideas above your station. And one of those is that the number of people qualified to do higher skilled or white collar jobs is not being kept up with by the number of such jobs available. But other things as well. There is a real problem with insecurity. So one of the things I found in the book is, and it was really noticeable, that I didn't pick these people for this. I picked these people because they were people who came from low income or working class backgrounds and found themselves in the professions or found themselves a billionaire or being a billionaire and or found themselves to be a politician or something like that. But what was really noticeable is that they all, although they had quite low incomes when they were starting out, they all lived in families where there were quite stable incomes.
Yes.
And quite stable housing tenure. And one of them said to me whilst I was writing it, oh yeah, it's hard to reach for the stars when you're barely clinging onto what you've got. I went off and looked at that, and that seems to be actually quite important, that for reasons of what insecurity does to your psychology and your mental health, and also your ability to just make plans for your future, it is really important to have security of income and security of housing tenure. And that's become more of a problem for people over recent decades.
So that's really interesting. So even though there was lower income, it was a roof over the head and a certain amount of security. They knew that a certain amount of money was going to be coming into the house each month.
Yeah, and they all had that, and not always because they were in stable jobs. Now, some of them, their parents were in really unstable jobs. One of them, for instance, was the MP, David Lammy.
Yes.
And he said to me that actually his housing tenure was stable because before his parents split up, before his dad left, they'd been able to have a mortgage on a house, which was possible on a working class income at that point. Then through family moving in together, they managed to keep up the mortgage. So that was good. But David said that he was also sheltered really from the income insecurity by his mum acting as a human shield. So she'd got insecure jobs working as what used to be called an Avon lady or as a cleaner or that sort of thing. And she did all those sorts of jobs at the cost to her own health, but it protected David and his siblings from that sort of insecurity.
Yeah, gave them the platform, the springboard to go from there.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And then you've mentioned you spoke to a diversity of people. How did you actually get hold of your sample? What was kind of your methodology, Duncan?
Partly I asked some advice from a journalist I know, and he said, okay, look at the trade press, because I didn't want to talk to people who had already been biographied, if you like.
Yes.
So I wanted people who weren't really on the radar, but people who had experienced social mobility. What I found in the trade press was really fascinating, because I used the phrase on Google, son of A or daughter of A. So I went to something like the Barrister magazine and searched for son of A and daughter of A. And what's interesting is in those professions is that if you are the son of a postman or something, it is so remarkable in that profession that the trade press will mention it. So it was quite easy to find people that way. There was unstructured interview. Well, actually, semi-structured interviews is what I did. So the book is very much about going through people's life course from the circumstances they grew up in as very young children through to wherever they happen to be now in stages. But I started off by asking them some really open questions, i.e. sort of what happened to you, or what is it that you did that led to your path diverging from the one taken by the kids you grew up with? And that was very deliberate because, as I said, the discourse I came across in academia and in politics about social mobility didn't reflect what had happened to me. So I didn't want to start with those relatively closed questions with other people. I wanted to ask them what they thought did it before I then started saying, okay, tell me about what happened in early years, and tell me what happened in school years, and then in the sort of choosing a path stage between 14 and 18.
Yeah. Thank you. You've already mentioned some of them. I wondered if we could pick out a couple of examples. So you mentioned the politician David Lammy, you spoke about a billionaire, I know you spoke to an actor and a surgeon as well. Is there one that kind of really stands out for you from the book?
I think a lot of them stood out in a number of ways, and some of them were quite prominent people like David, who a lot of people have heard of.
Yes.
But one of the people I ended up really just admiring is a young woman who may well now be a doctor. I'm not sure what stage she's at, called Joanne Martin, who grew up in the Postle Park estate in Glasgow. And basically said when she was at school, I think I want to be a doctor, was told not to be so silly. And the amount of F you, I won't do what you told me, she has got is fantastic, because she was told not to be silly, and she pursued a medical career anyway. Her school didn't offer the hires, the Scottish equivalent of A-levels, that she needed to do to pursue a medical course. So she travelled for a round trip of like 3 or 4 hours, each of 4 days a week across Glasgow to go to somewhere where she could sit those exams. She got all the results, and then she was turned down by all the medical schools that she'd applied to because she didn't know how to play the game of the admissions procedure. And basically took a year out to study university admissions. She's a real hero for me.
I wondered if that was quite a common feature, that kind of stoicism or defiance in some way. Was that quite a common feature among the people you spoke to?
There's a lot of it. And as I say, that stoicism of really putting up with the sorts of structures that put you in stress positions and put you in uncomfortable positions when you're trying to move in a world designed around people of a so-called higher class than you. But some people just ended up sort of swept there to where they got to, really. So one of them, the other people, is Barbara Stocking, who was a chief executive of Oxfam some years ago, among other things. And she said that she went to school with some girls, a pair of twins, who were the daughters of a prominent local business person. And their family's attitude, if you like, is our girls are going to go to Cambridge. And their girls were the friends of Barbara. And Barbara really got what she called swept in the updraft. And that is really important as well. A number of people who spoke to me use the same phrase, which I noticed, which was, I had a posh friend.
Yeah.
And the role of those posh friends in revealing that previously unimagined educational options or previously unimagined careers even exist is really strong. Also then being what I call a crap role model, by which I mean that they are aspiring to being a barrister or a doctor or whatever it is, and you know them, so you know that they're not a Superman. And by them being slightly crap, you can think, oh, well, I could do that as well. It's not just for people who are absolutely great. Like, if you hear the phrase, a brilliant scientist, you guess that you have to be brilliant to do that.
Yes.
But if you have a friend who's looked well on the way to being a scientist, but you think they're a bit normal and a bit crap like all humans are, that really helps.
That's a really good point. That's really good.
But those people also help in that they guide you as well, because the sort of paths to those elite careers or even middle-class careers aren't always properly signposted what you have to do. So it's useful to have someone to say, oh yeah, jobs are advertised in this place, or oh, this is how you do a job application to make it sound good, or all those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's kind of that importance of social capital.
Oh, it is, absolutely. And that social mixing is really important. And again, it's something that can be threatened. It can be threatened by, we've got quite a lot of segregation in our schools. Obviously, fee-paying schools are one of those, but the way that areas that still have selective schools segregate middle classes into grammar schools and everybody else into the other ones. But also things like catchment areas mean that you get quite a lot of that works as a way of segregating people where you can't meet those posh friends.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll explore some more examples.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Hello and welcome back to part 2 of The Sociology Show. My guest is Duncan Exley. We're talking about his book, The End of Aspiration. Duncan, I've got to ask you about the billionaire, because that's, when we're talking about social mobility, that's some leap, isn't it? From working class to billionaire. Do you mind saying a little bit about that one?
Oh yeah, the billionaire is Mark Dixon. He's best known for there's a chain of office accommodation called Regus, where you can go along and hire 1 or 2 desks or whatever it is. He set up that. He's the son of a motor mechanic from Essex, and he had a really interesting journey as well, as you can imagine. That he went off working his way around the world, had a working year off when he left school, didn't go to university, invested the money he'd earned doing that in a hot dog van on the North Circular. And invested the takings from that in another hot dog van, and eventually had noticed that it was sometimes quite difficult to get hold of the hot dog buns, so he sold up and got a bakery and built up that way. And that was, again, that posh friends came into it, because he said that when he had his first bakery, it was part of a building that was a factory owned by somebody else, and that person who owned the factory was a really good mentor to him. But also, one of the things that I was asking at each stage in his journey is, okay, how did you get the finance for that? And at each stage in the journey, he said, well, I went to banks, of course I did, but they always turned me down.
Yes.
Because he was, and to quote him directly, I was some oik from Essex. And so that lack of social polish and the lack of knowing somebody who was, I said, that posh friend who can tell you the tricks of the trade in terms of putting a bid together for some business loan, sort of held him back, if anything, even though he's a billionaire now. And I think that was really quite an important thing.
We mentioned social capital, but you're kind of talking about cultural capital there, aren't you, as well? The days where you had to put on a suit and do your hair to go and speak to the bank manager to try and lend you some money. It's all about that. You've got to speak right, you've got to look right, you've got to prove yourself in terms of your cultural capital.
Absolutely, and that was something that was obviously problematic for him, but was encountered by other people I came across an awful lot as well. So one of them, Dean, for example, he had escaped, as he put it, from the background where he grew up, an estate in Coventry. He was a gay man. There was significant homophobia. He said that someone had actually been murdered on his estate because someone thought they were gay. So he really wanted to get away. But when he got to university, where he thought, okay, this is a whole new place, again, he was a misfit, for whom social mobility was a route to somewhere that he thought he wouldn't be a misfit. He found himself a misfit again because he didn't have that social capital. He didn't have the means to strike up conversations with people, and that was quite problematic for him, and he dropped out of university.
That's quite a common theme, isn't it, amongst many people, that they don't feel comfortable in that environment.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I think about a lot is that there is data showing that if you have people from working class backgrounds who go to university, compared to somebody from a middle class background who got the same A-level scores or higher scores, they will do better in their final exams.
Yes.
Now, the thinking behind that is obviously the people from a middle class background have run faster to do their A levels because they've had the performance enhancers, if you like, provided by their background and their school. Whereas when everybody's on a level playing field in the same university, then it's the potential rather than the privilege which plays out. But actually, what's forgotten a lot of the time is that they're not on the same level playing field. They're on a slightly less unlevel playing field because higher education itself, especially the so-called elite universities, put people from lower income and lower social and cultural capital backgrounds on the back foot as well.
Thank you, Duncan. And I need to ask you a bit more about the title, because some of the stories you've said have been real success stories, but you did mention the full title says Our Children's Fading Prospects. So did you want to say a little bit more about that part?
Oh, absolutely, yes. It's because you've got to bear in mind that the people who I interviewed, they're newsworthy because they're unusual.
Yes.
And that methodology I had of finding them, of looking through the trade press for whatever their particular profession is, and it being mentioned that they came from a working class or a low income background, points up really that they were unusual, or the trade press wouldn't have mentioned it. I remember reading an article about a Conservative cabinet member by another Tory grandee who said, "Oh yes, he's a fascinating fellow. You know, he grew up in council housing with a single mum." And I thought, well, it's not that fascinating to grow up in council housing, is it? You know, when this person was growing up, then about a third of the population lived in council housing, and no one was saying he's a fascinating fellow, he went to Eton, you know, because it seems weirdly normal in those circles. And I think that was one of the telling things about how newsworthy these people were in their own profession, from coming from a background which in normal society would not be considered newsworthy. They were newsworthy from coming from an ordinary background. But really, those things which I found to be the four recurring themes of people who had managed to pursue opportunities that are normally reserved for the middle classes are all under threat. That's why it's called Our Children's Fading Prospects. So that idea of stability in income and tenure are being threatened by jobs with less secure contracts, by more people being in private rented accommodation. The social mixing, as I said, is threatened by more segregation, not just in education, but also in extracurricular activities and in where people live. I talked about people finding routes to opportunity that don't have toll booths on them. That has been threatened for a while by things like expecting people to have done an unpaid internship, which not everyone can afford to do. Or also just by things like schools that perform well in the Ofsted ratings are more likely to have expensive uniforms, or to require their pupils to come in with tablet devices, which they've paid for themselves. But I think really the biggest thing is that the objects of people's aspirations, the thing that most people aspire to, if you look at the polling, are a job I love, a home to call my own, and the wherewithal to have a relationship and a family. And those things are in increasingly short supply because of I talked about the supply of higher skilled or white collar jobs not keeping up with the demand for them. We know that the number of people who own their own home is going down, not up. And there is data now on increasing numbers of people saying, you know what, I am putting off, or I have completely abandoned my plans to start a family because we don't have the security of income, we don't have a we don't have the sort of home we want to bring up a child in.
Yeah, certainly noticeable. I'm in the Brighton and Hove area where, a one-bedroom flat would set you back £250,000, and you just wonder how are people ever going to get on the property ladder? It's just
Absolutely.
not going to happen.
The property thing is really, I think if there's one thing that really sums up that end of aspiration thing, it's that your chances of home ownership, which used to be in that sort of post-war period of rising social mobility, it used to be part of the deal on home ownership that if you worked hard at school, if you worked hard in your job, you could get yourself a home, and you could get yourself a home for you and your family. But increasingly, the most important thing that will predict whether you can buy your own home is whether your parents have bought your own home.
Yeah.
So homes are now bought not by that aspirational model of an individual working hard, but by the almost feudal model.
Yeah, inheritance,
of inheritance, and having parents who can remortgage on their house to give you a deposit and that sort of stuff. That is absolutely the opposite of that sort of rhetoric of work hard and reap the rewards.
Yeah. I just wonder, Duncan, I teach teenagers myself, and increasingly what I'm seeing is that they're looking for a quicker kind of instant gratification. Many want to be a social influencer, a YouTuber or something like that, because the university route is just so expensive, riddled with debt, and still doesn't guarantee you're going to get your own home and a secure job at the end of it anyway.
No, it doesn't. And that's a real problem. One of the people I went to see speaking whilst I was doing this research was Rushnor Ali, MP for, I think, Bethnal Green and Bow, who was saying that there's been a real admirable effort from teachers and educationists and all sorts of people to get people from places like Bethnal Green and Bow going to university, where previous generations there wouldn't have thought about it. It's actually got some quite high rates now. But then you've got graduates coming back, people's elder brothers and sisters, and people's cousins, and people they see around the community saying to them, I went to university and and I'm working in Costa.
Yeah.
And what's that about? And that is a real problem, the one that I keep coming back to, that in the third quarter of the 20th century, we got absolute upward social mobility because there was such an explosion in new, more highly skilled opportunities caused by the expansion of the public sector and the jobs that brought, and by what Harold Wilson didn't actually call the white heat of the technological revolution. And social mobility, you can educate and you can train people as much as you like to be absolutely best placed to compete for these opportunities. But if there are no more opportunities, then no more people are going to get them.
And you do worry whether this will be exacerbated by the pandemic as well.
I think that's the pandemic is a really big thing on that, because we can see ourselves shedding jobs. Also, having had Brexit happen, we're now desperate to get trade deals with people. And it is a worry that in our desperation to get trade deals, we'll be negotiating for getting to specialise in whatever. Other people who don't need a trade deal so desperately because they haven't just left a trading block can take their time and hold out for things like getting to specialise in high-value sectors. That's a worry to me.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Duncan. Could I ask you to finish off by telling people a little bit more about where they can get hold of the book, and also where they can get in touch with you should they want to?
Oh, absolutely, yes. You said the book's called The End of Aspiration, social mobility in our children's fading prospects. And yeah, it's available from wherever you normally get books from, to be honest. I'd recommend independent bookshops at this time because they're suffering. And how to get hold of me, I'm on Twitter as Duncan_Exley.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you very much for your time today, and a lot of food for thought there about social mobility and particularly our children's futures as well. I think that's a really, really important discussion to have.
That's great. It's been really good talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for The Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.